Hello guys, if you're building a project with a few roles like admin and then simple user and then for example driver, you can build admin panel with something like Filament or Laravel Nova or some admin panel. But what about other roles? Should they be also inside of Filament in this case, or you build a separate panel with Laravel, like Laravel Breeze in this case? And in this video, I will show you side by side two options of the same project. And at the end of this video, I will announce a pretty clear winner in my books. How will I create similar projects in the future? So we will dive into the code comparing filament and non-filament approach of this Upwork job. It's task booking and dispatch system, something like Upwork but for delivery. So let me zoom in a bit more. So there's user, admin, and service provider. I renamed it to customer, admin, and driver. And these are basically three things that you need to implement. Also notifications, and then everything else doesn't matter that much. This job is not even Laravel. It may be Laravel, but it's not specified strictly. So I decided to try to implement this job just because structurally it's similar to so many SaaS solutions. So there's a user who wants to order something. There's another side like marketplace doing something with the same objects like tasks. It could be not necessarily tasks, maybe some projects, but basically two roles and then admin on top. I've seen thousands of such projects online structurally. So by trying to implement this project, I envision you could reuse the same logic for others. So, as I'm a fan of Filament admin panel, the admin panel, as I told you, is built with Filament. So admins can manage tasks, manage users, both drivers and customers. So this is the clear part. But then, if drivers wants to log in or simple users, one option is to use Filament as well, building separate panels for customers and drivers. So this is exactly what I did, /customer/login. And if I log in as a customer, I see my tasks also in Filament, but not as admin. Or alternative is front-end starter kit like Laravel Breeze. It could be one of the official starter kits. You log in and then you don't even see the Filament admin panel, which is only for admin users. Here you manage your tasks as a customer. So the overall question, which is better approach? I will compare both the code and the experience and the result and maintainability of both versions for the future. Let's dive into the code. First, let's compare the installation process. If you want to stay with just Filament, you install Laravel New without any starter kit, so like Laravel New Test, for example. You choose None here, you go through all the installation of default Laravel without any starter kit, and then you use Filament kind of like starter kit for admin role and for other roles as well, and you install different panels. You may be tempted to have it in one panel. It depends on the project. It is possible, but in this particular case, the task CRUD was different for different roles, so I decided to separate them into three different Filament panels. So yeah, you finish with Laravel installation, you go to Filament installation. In this case, I will use Filament 4 beta version, which is pretty stable already. So you do compose require, PHP artisan filament install, and then basically you have Filament project, and you don't even really touch that much of Laravel front except for maybe creating a landing page on top. So as a result of my installation, we have landing page of Laravel and we have Filament admin panel where you create all your logic for admins and for customers. So that is if you go Filament way. If you go Laravel Breeze way, I will demonstrate with Laravel Breeze, but any Laravel starter kit actually can be done in the same way. So you do Laravel New Test, and here you may choose the starter kit that you want, or you may choose Laravel Breeze, and this is installed afterwards. Laravel Breeze is not in the list of the official starter kits for Laravel 12, but here's an article on Laravel Daily how to still use Laravel Breeze. It's just doing compose require after the installation, so Breeze still works. It's just not in the official options during the installation. And in fact, to be honest, I'm glad for that in a way, because sometimes I do forget to install starter kit. So in this case, you could install Laravel. So here I am, I'm finished with Laravel installation. Then you may install Filament. So I will perform the same installation steps for Filament. And then at some point you realize that you may want to have the front end page with login and registration for users outside of Filament, so you want to install Starter Kit, but this is too late for the official starter kits. They are installable only in the very beginning. For Laravel Breeze, it's not the case. You do compose or require. Even after Filament is installed, it actually uses the same auth mechanism under the hood, and then you run PHP Artisan Breeze install Blade, and it installs Laravel Breeze, and as a result, I will show you what we have. So test is still the homepage, but we have login and register from Laravel Breeze, which works. And let me show you. I will copy the email and I will try to log in with the same user after that in the Filament. So we do have Laravel Breeze, it works. And if we log out and we go to /admin, we have Filament, and I will use the same email and password, and here I am inside of Filament. Of course, you need to restrict that with roles, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but basically Breeze and Filament work side by side together separately. So this is the installation process. Now let's dive into more features which I've built, and let's compare the code side by side. So I will show you the code of Filament version in Cursor editor and Laravel version in PHP Storm. I use actually both editors depending on what is the task. So I will talk about two comparison kind of criteria: developer experience and user experience, the end user. And let's start with the developer experience. Which code is easier to write, Filament or Laravel Breeze and Laravel? So for example, to create a menu item of my tasks here as a CRUD, typical CRUD, here's the route file of Filament project, and you saw that already. Here's the route file of Laravel project. In other words, if you work with Filament, pretty much all the logic happens inside of folder app Filament, you can see on the left. And here I have, as I mentioned, separate panels. So app Filament customer, then app Filament driver, and then app Filament without the folder is the main admin panel for admin. And then each admin panel has resources, basically one CRUD, one resource. And then you define what columns should be in the table, for example, tasks table, and then you define text column, other columns. For example, this is date column. For example, this is sortable. This is a batch column with different label. This is, by the way, relationship, which is auto-resolved by Filament with eager loading. Here, for example, for the address, you modify that with pickup and drop-off address, and you limit the size to 50. So basically you work with Filament features. So basically you just hit arrow and then start typing. For example, you want label, okay. There's a label function and you fill in the value. And in a similar fashion, you define the forms. So for example, as a customer, I want to book a new task, and this is the form, and the fields are defined in the same resource, schemas, task, form. This is syntax of Filament 4, by the way. So again, text input, text area, date time picker, and other inputs. In other words, with Filament, you're basically working with configuring the fields for tables and for forms, and then custom pages on top. And then for table, for example, you define actions, not only the columns. So in the task resource here, there's form, there's table, and then there's also info list to view the task. This is a feature of Filament. For example, you can click any of those tasks, and this is the view. And in this case, I don't have any actions as a customer, but as a driver, for example, I will log into drivers panel with drivers login with another user, and here I have actions, view task, or for example, complete task, or accept task if it's not accepted yet. So those actions are also defined similarly in drivers, resources task. We go to tasks table, and here we have not only columns, and somewhere here, yep, record actions. And here you define the view action and then action make with label, color, description, confirmation, and then what should happen after that action is clicked. So basically, to create a CRUD, you need to learn all those features of Filament, which most of them actually are pretty easy to learn, especially with practice. A lot of them are auto-completed by your IDE or even by AI. And also those are pretty intuitive, like text column, text area, and those names are easy to get familiar with. So this is the developer experience overall with Filament. Now with Laravel, here I am here in my PHP Storm, and by the way, through all those years I haven't found how to increase the font in the sidebar to make it bigger, so I increased the font here in the main area but not on the sidebar, sorry. So in Filament, it's all in the app Filament resources and panels. In Laravel, it's freedom. So whatever you define in the routes, you need to create everything manually. So route group for customer, route group for driver, and then whatever else comes on top. In this case, by the way, I still use admin Filament for admin panel, and on the front end is just role customer and role driver. And then you create everything in controller, basically manually. All those methods of index, what should be the logic of ordering. So you write eloquent queries, you write validations, you may put them in form requests if you prefer. You may or may not use request validated here. So basically you define everything here in the controller. Then you manually define the blade view with the layout, with all the buttons, with the routes again, with the table and fields, with what is visible, what is the format. You format the dates, you format the numbers, you check if the relationship exists, you create the badge pretty much manually yourself with colors if you want to. So in other words, as I said, the word freedom, which means you start from clean sheet and you create controller, blade view, validation logic, and everything in between. Laravel can generate the basics for you, the structure. So if you run PHP Artisan make controller for resource controller, or Artisan make view will generate a blade file, but it's empty by default. And Tailwind is also pre-configured, but you need to write those Tailwind classes yourself. So in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that in the beginning, for typical CRUD, doing it without Filament is much more manual work. Unless you have that prepared somewhere from other project and you would basically copy paste from somewhere, from some template. But if you start from PHP Artisan commands, PHP Artisan make Filament resource will generate resource for you with all the design. It may even generate the columns for you if you use -- generate flag with the command. And with Laravel, you're kind of on your own. So from developer experience, for simple CRUD, for the beginning, Filament is a clear winner. You would think so, but that freedom that I mentioned is not only giving you more work to do, but also gives you more, well, freedom of choices. So this is where we come to user experience. Just visually, this is a Filament project, and it will always look like Filament project. You may change some colors, some layout, you may put the menu on top, you may change the fonts here and there, but basically it will look like Filament, and if you have worked with Filament, you will always recognize a Filament project. There are no design choices, design templates, or themes, or too many customizations. You can do that a lot with things like render hooks, and this is kind of advanced Filament level, but all the elements are pretty much predefined, and you may hook just here and there, like put something above the table, below the sidebar, here on the top right. But if personal branding and uniqueness is important for your client, for front-end users, for customers and drivers, then Filament may be too restricting in that case. With Laravel, here's the design of Laravel Breeze, but you may again choose any Laravel starter kit, which would come with different design, or even use your own starter kit, or even start from scratch. That freedom, as I said, gives you more freedom for choice of user interface. So for admin panel, it's great. Admins don't really care about visual design, they care about experience. For managing the data, and Filament is great for that. But for branding, if you care about visual appeal, you may want to get more creative than Filament structure. Next, I will compare other features of Filament versus Laravel, like authentication mechanism, editing profile, and other pages. But before we do that, if you want to get the repositories for both, they are published on filamentexamples.com, our repository of Filament examples that we created over a few years, I guess. Currently, it's 70-something, 78 examples, and 2 latest ones are separate 2 versions of the same project. By the way, I haven't shown you the homepage. Pretty important. This is how it looks. So you may have any Tailwind or even Bootstrap design before someone logs into Filament or not Filament, and then when you click, for example, book a service or become a driver, then you're redirected to, for example, customer register in Laravel Breeze, or in case of Filament, if I sign out and I go to the home page, this is how it looks. book a service, I get to registration form of Filament. So in both cases, homepage doesn't even know what is the auth structure. Homepage just puts the link to one or another. So yeah, both of those repositories are for members of filamentexamples.com. It's a one-time purchase which gives you the access to repository with all those projects. And these two projects are the first ones with Filament v4, which is still in the beta phase, but stable enough to be used in production projects, in my personal opinion. On my second channel, Filament Daily, I have a few videos about that. Recent one is v3 versus v4 beta, but also a few more videos about upcoming version 4. So if you are into Filament, watch those videos and subscribe to my channel. Also with Filament 4, on Laravel Daily Courses, one of the popular courses is about Filament 3, and I'm planning to update it to Filament 4, or in fact create a totally new course for Filament 4 as soon as it's out of beta, probably by the end of the summer. That course is already in progress. I'm just waiting for the final touches from the official Filament team, and then I will finish my course as soon as I can. But if you haven't worked with Filament at all, you may still want to use Filament 3 course to get familiar with the system, and Filament 3 will be supported for many years to come, I guess. So you may start with v3 as well for your projects. Now back to comparing the code of Filament versus Laravel authentication. Let's talk about login and register. And login and register is trivial in Laravel Breeze, for example. This is the login form, so I didn't have to change anything here. But what I did have to change is become a driver registration form contains more fields than default Laravel registration. So the field vehicle type is not in the default Laravel Breeze. So that's why there's a separate driver register controller, which is similar to the default register controller of Breeze. But on top of that, we have driver register and customer register. Because they have a bit different fields, and also after the registration in the store method, which is almost copy-pasted from Laravel Breeze. But in addition, we're adding a role ID here, and then we redirect to driver tasks index to the driver panel. In the customer register controller, it's almost the same. We're just redirecting to customer panel and assigning customer role. To achieve that in Filament, it's very similar. App Filament driver, pages, there's registration page, which overrides the default registration page of Filament, and I add radio button. Again, this is the syntax of Filament to add a field, and I need to override the handling of registration, again adding role ID. So roughly similar amount of work in terms of customizing registration for Laravel or for Filament. You still need to create custom code for that. Now, the restriction between the forms, for example, so that customers wouldn't be able to access admin and vice versa. In Filament, the panels are restricted on a user level. So in the app models user, there's a function called can access panel, and then based on panel ID, we define the condition which panel can be used by which user role. In case of Laravel, you saw that already. Role customer or role driver is the middleware, which is defined in Bootstrap app. Here, middleware alias. This is the name of the middleware, and then inside of that middleware class, we're checking for role name and abort with 403 forbidden if that is not the correct role. So from that point of view, restriction on the backend also pretty comparable. Maybe a bit more work with Laravel with middlewares, but roughly comparable. I'm still comparing the amount of work when you work with Filament or with Laravel. Finally, there's a page to edit profile. So in Laravel, it's Laravel Breeze form, but also for drivers, we need to add additional few fields. And similar for drivers, I go to profile and I see vehicle type and available for tasks or not at the moment. So how easy it is to customize. In Laravel, we have profile by Laravel Breeze. So profile controller has edit and update methods, and there's separately update driver, which we create for driver fields specifically, and also driver profile update request with the validation. And in the edit form, in the profile edit blade, we have if statement to include that section, that portion of the form, which looks like this. This is a separate form. This is how generally those form sections work with Laravel Breeze, with a little bit of Alpine to save the data right away instead of refreshing the full page. But this is almost copy-paste from other update sections of the same form. In case of Filament, it's app Filament driver pages edit profile page, where we override the base edit profile. Similar logic how we override the registration form. We repeat the same methods from the base class, and then we add more fields like this. And then we also need to add custom logic for filling the form with data from the database, and the opposite, saving the form for the driver fields. So also kind of comparable amount of work for customizing the profile. And finally, I want to emphasize the Filament admin dashboard. So this is one of the reasons why I didn't even try to recreate that outside of Filament, because Filament shines here massively. So to create something like this with widgets, with tables, with charts, it's not that impressive because it's not that much of data faked. But basically to achieve all of that, you define widgets in app Filament widgets. There are 4 widgets here. For example, chart is defined by get data. So you prepare the data with Eloquent and then transforming that into separate format of data sets and labels for the chart. You specify the type, you specify more options, how it would look, and that's it. Again, similar thing, you configure that in Filament without caring about any routes, controllers, or blades, or styling. You work pretty much only with Filament syntax. Similar, another widget, this is base widgets to get the stats, again, Eloquent query, and then you return stat make. One stat make is this block, total tasks, then pending tasks and other tasks, and you define the statistics however you want. So yeah, I get back to the idea earlier that Filament shines for admin functions, CRUD behavior, dashboard, and managing the data. To recreate similar in Laravel, it would take much more work for me personally just for visual styling because I'm not a Tailwind professional. So this is where I come to the overall conclusion. If I see the project in the future with similar functionality of admin panel and then one or more roles on top, front-end users, probably in most cases, I will create that front-end functionality with Laravel just because of more freedom of choices for how it looks visually. And for admin panel to manage the data, I will stay with Filament. Another reason for you maybe is that you don't want to dive too deep to Filament syntax and learn Filament, because if you want to customize pages, you need to basically learn another framework on top of Laravel. Filament is great and it has a ton of features, and this is kind of the blessing and the curse. Documentation is huge, it's all in there, most of it at least, but sometimes it's hard to find exactly the customization you want. This is where, by the way, our Filament examples project became popular, because we're trying to showcase a lot of those customizations, like as you can see, attendance form, calendar, Google Maps, something like grid cards for the table. You would not easily find that in the Filament docs in a ready-to-use mode. But yeah, what do you think about my decision and train of thoughts? Filament versus Laravel for user-facing part of the application. Or what logic you use in your projects. Let's discuss in the comments below. That's it for this time, and see you guys in other videos.